Borderlands 4 is on the horizon, and people are calling it Gearbox's last chance for the Borderlands franchise. Like it or not, Gearbox has to absolutely nail the launch of Borderlands 4, and naturally there are a few really fatal mistakes that Gearbox could make to absolutely bury Borderlands 4. Hey Vault Hunters, I'm Constant Canadian, and these are the fatal mistakes Gearbox needs to avoid in Borderlands 4. If you enjoy this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe as it really helps out the channel, and if you really enjoy the video, consider joining the membership program. 99 cents a month gets you a shoutout at the end of my videos, as well as these cute emotes and awesome sub badges. And for $4.99 a month, you get all that, plus early access to most of my videos. One of the biggest mistakes Gearbox could make is one they've made 3 times already in the past, and that is not having dedicated drops at launch. Borderlands the pre-sequel launched with basically no dedicated drops, and its publisher went bankrupt long before they ever bothered fixing it. Borderlands 3 also launched without dedicated drops, and Gearbox changed that pretty quickly. And Wonderlands also launched without dedicated drops, and still to this day doesn't have them, instead relying entirely on world drops and the Chaos Bunnies to get most of your loot. Borderlands 4 needs to have dedicated drops on launch, or else a very large majority of the game's biggest fans won't be bothered playing it. Say what you will about world drop farming in Borderlands 3, but it is a lot easier to farm for a specific weapon, artifact, or class mod if there's a dedicated source for that item. And despite what my comments section might tell me every time I bring this up, world drop farming from Borderlands 3 can exist perfectly fine with dedicated drop farming. These two systems don't have to be separate. Every time Gearbox has released a Borderlands game without dedicated drops or respawning named enemies, it has been met with crazy amounts of backlash. It's clear that fans of the franchise want dedicated farming back, and if Borderlands 4 doesn't have this at launch, the franchise could be doomed. Another very big mistake Gearbox could make in Borderlands 4 is having too many different unique items. This is a huge mistake that Gearbox made with Borderlands 3, and it's in turn led to a very large majority of useless weapons, artifacts, and class mods. Borderlands 3 has more legendary weapons than all of the other Borderlands games have unique weapons. And this leads to a lot of different problems, like the game being completely impossible to balance, repeat weapons like the Dictator to the Monarch, the Embrace the Pain to the Pain is Power, the TK's Wave to the Tidal Wave, and many more. But more importantly, having too many unique items leads to over-bloated loot pools, which kind of goes hand in hand with the last point. There are so many different weapons in Borderlands 3 to the point where dedicated sources in the game have 2, 3, 4, or even 5 different dedicated drops in their pool, which, especially when they're at the end of a long mobbing section that has to be completed to kill this source, like takedowns and trials, completely kills any desire to farm these items. Specific legendaries are also just getting far too rare. Borderlands 3 literally showers you with legendaries, and yet somehow, getting even one decent piece of gear is more rare than ever before, with the insane amounts of parts combinations available for various weapons, class mods, and artifacts. Borderlands is a looter shooter that has built its brand on having a bazillion guns. But even though it seems like more drops would equal more better for a looter shooter, in more ways than it helped, having too many legendaries in Borderlands 3 has been a huge problem that causes a pretty decent amount of the game's issues. Gearbox needs to be very mindful of adding too many different weapons to Borderlands 4, as too much of a good thing can be a very bad thing. The next damning mistake Gearbox could make with Borderlands 4 is having Lifesteal. Lifesteal has been in every single Borderlands game since Borderlands 2. In Borderlands 2 and the pre-sequel, Lifesteal was mostly gained through Moxie weapons. But in Borderlands 3, every single character, aside from Flak, has some sort of lifesteal in their trees. Moze has Russian Offensive and the Sapper class mod, Amara's got Sustainment, and Zane's got Salvation. The issue with lifesteal in Borderlands games is just that the damage being dealt by the player in all of these games makes lifesteal absolutely broken. At level 72, even with a bad setup, your character is capable of dealing millions of damage per second, which with only a 1% lifesteal, lower than any character can have, is still tens of thousands of health back every second. That's with a bad setup though. With a decent setup, you're easily able to deal tens of millions of damage every second, and thus restore hundreds of thousands of health every single second, completely abusing health gate and giving your character next to no use for any other survivability skills. After all, why would I bother speccing up a crapload of damage reduction, max health, and health regen when I can simply shoot once and get all of my health back? Lifesteal shouldn't be in a game where millions of damage is the expectation. So unless Borderlands 4 turns down the damage numbers a significant amount, which we all know won't happen, then Lifesteal shouldn't be in Borderlands 4. Another huge mistake that could happen in Borderlands 4 is making the endgame be completely reliant on one single mechanic. This is a massive issue in Borderlands 2, where slag is necessary to deal almost any sort of damage past Ultimate Vault Hunter mode. And it's also an issue in Borderlands 3, where anointments take the place of slag, being required by the majority of builds to actually kill anything. Don't get me wrong, I think that both slag and anointments were in theory really good ideas, and I even use slag in normal and true Vault Hunter mode in Borderlands 2 when I need a little bit more damage. Where it becomes an issue is when these mechanics become mandatory for endgame builds. Anointments and slag are cool sources of extra damage, but when my character does nothing without them, it's a problem. No game should be requiring us to use a mechanic we don't like simply to deal damage. Anytime the conversation of slag comes up on Reddit and other forums, the near universal reply is, "It was a cool mechanic, but it sucked that it was required." And it's the same deal with anointments. They were a cool idea and had the potential to be a fun mechanic until they became required for Mayhem 6 and up. If Borderlands 4 repeats this same mistake by introducing some random mechanic and forcing it on players after a certain point, anybody who doesn't like the mechanic is going to go straight back to their preferred Borderlands game, whether that's 2, 3, or even Borderlands 1. New Game Plus is one of my favorite parts of games. Giving us a chance to replay the game with a fully spec'd out character is awesome. And that's why I've spent so long playing Borderlands 1, 2, and 3. In Borderlands 3, however, there is no reason to play through the story a second time, which is honestly kind of a good thing considering the subpar writing of the game, but even considering that, there's no reason for anybody to play the story a second time. In Wonderlands, we don't even have an option for a second playthrough at all. Wonderlands is far and above better in terms of writing than Borderlands 3, and despite that, True Vault Hunter mode is completely missing from the game. The biggest problem with True Vault Hunter mode in Borderlands 3 is that there's literally zero reason to do the second playthrough. You go through the story the second time just for funsies, which in the case of Borderlands 3 isn't likely. And while there is a slight difference between normal mode and True Vault Hunter mode, the moment you turn on Mayhem, any differences are completely gone. True Vault Hunter mode isn't harder, drop chances aren't higher, skills aren't stronger, there's literally zero difference. While a New Game Plus shouldn't be mandatory like it is in Borderlands 2, there should be some sort of incentive for doing it, whether it be a higher loot chance or just a harder experience. If Borderlands 4 doesn't have a New Game Plus of some sort that actually has an incentive, then it might be over for the franchise. Now for another mistake that Gearbox is guilty of making on multiple accounts. Having a stale and repetitive endgame scaling. Let me explain. In Borderlands 2, you get OP levels. This increases the level of your loot up to 10 levels, as well as your enemies, giving them insane damage reduction up to 70%. This makes enemies way harder to kill while giving the player a slight damage increase. In Borderlands 3, you have Mayhem levels. This will increase enemies' health, shield, and armor by up to 10,000%, as well as increase your weapons level by up to 10 levels. Once again, making enemies far tankier and giving the player slightly more damage. The only difference being that with Mayhem mode, your skills actually scale up, and there's also modifiers, but we won't talk about those because those are awful. Now moving on to Wonderlands. Wonderlands gives you Chaos levels. Chaos levels increase enemy health by up to 4,471% and enemy damage by up to 200%, as well as giving the character a chance at more powerful weapons. This once again makes enemies substantially tankier and stronger, while moderately increasing player damage. By now I'm sure you've noticed a problem with this. In every single Borderlands game, bar Borderlands 1, the endgame levels simply increase enemy health while slightly increasing player damage. Aside from increasing XP, cash, and loot drops, that's pretty much all the endgame scaling of these games does. Now it would be one thing if the endgame scaling was actually fun, but as I'm sure anyone would agree, increasing enemy health is not a good way to make the game harder. It just makes the game take longer. Time and time again, Gearbox has recycled the exact same endgame scaling with each new iteration, and it's just quite frankly getting stale. There are many other ways that Gearbox could make Borderlands harder without simply increasing enemy HP, and yet for some reason that's all they keep doing. If Borderlands 4 comes out with just another reskinned version of OP levels, I don't think that it would necessarily kill the game, but I do think that it could significantly hurt the longevity of it. These have all been pretty big mistakes that while they would certainly hurt the game, they wouldn't absolutely bury Borderlands 4. These last two mistakes, however, could single-handedly destroy Borderlands 4. The first of which is drastic, untested, unwarranted, unwanted changes to the endgame scaling. This has happened multiple times throughout the franchise, with the jump from OP8 to OP10, the jump from Mayhem 3 to 4, and again with the huge jump from Mayhem 4 to 10 or 11. And this even happened in Wonderlands every time new Chaos levels were introduced. Gearbox has a really bad habit of randomly shifting the final endgame balance of their games, seemingly out of nowhere. which would be one thing, but the problem is most of the time these changes feel completely untested and unwanted. To this day, I have not seen a single person who thinks that OP10 was a good idea, especially after a level cap increase. Now, I really don't know who's calling the shots over at Gearbox, but time and time again, they've pushed out unbalanced endgame updates that immediately put a halt on the large majority of builds as the player base rushes to figure out which weapons and items work now, and which don't. I'm not trying to say that changes are a bad thing, but more often than not, these changes are so dramatic that Gearbox needs to follow them up with a week or two of massive buffs to various skills, weapons, and alike. Then a week or two of nerfs to take some of the overbuffed weapons back down. This has happened multiple times in Borderlands 3's lifetime as well as Wonderland's lifetime, which leads me to my next point. Borderlands 3 had a rough development cycle, with it initially not having dedicated drops, then the big jump to Mayhem 4 followed by the massive jump to Mayhem 10. It was very hard to get comfortable with any character or any build, as every time you did, the game seemingly shifted entirely. The first 2 years of Borderlands 3 has been dubbed the Nerf Apocalypse by the community, as every single week there was seemingly a new set of nerfs that completely destroyed various player builds. Don't get me wrong, there were also a lot of buffs throughout this period too, more than there were nerfs if we're being completely objective, but the fact that so much work needed to be done to balance Borderlands 3 says a lot. Gearbox needs to know what they want in terms of balance from Borderlands 4. We shouldn't need months upon months of buffs and nerfs after the launch of the game to make it feel good. With the launch of every new piece of content with the exception of the last 2 DLCs, Gearbox released a bunch of weapons, then proceeded to go, whoopsie, that's too strong, and then nerfed them, seemingly by some random number with little care for how it performs afterward. This happened with the Yellow Cake, Crossroads, Flacker, and many other weapons. It's not even just the nerfs themselves that were dumb, but more so the fact that most of the time the nerfs made very little sense, as they were oftentimes way too strong and never corrected. I understand that nerfs and buffs are a necessary part of this game, and all games realistically, but the fact that for the first month after Mayhem 2.0's launch, the only viable weapons were the ones being buffed in the following week's hotfixes is bad. This is the biggest mistake that would absolutely kill Borderlands 4, as despite the fact that Gearbox was pretty much only buffing for the last 2 years of Borderlands 3, it's still known as the Nerf Apocalypse game by much of the community to this day. Borderlands 4 needs to actually have its balance in order and needs to avoid any huge changes to actually keep the balance steady. Otherwise, Borderlands 4 might as well be dead on arrival. These mistakes have been made by Gearbox time and time again, but hopefully they finally learn from their mistakes and make Borderlands 4 the greatest yet. I want to know what your expectations are for Borderlands 4. Are you hopeful, worried, cautiously optimistic? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a fantastic day.